James Wan may currently be finding himself dealing with Aquaman and producing ghost adventures with the Conjuring series, but there was once a time where he was known as the co-creator of Saw, and the world was his oyster. Approached by project after project, there was one based on the world of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre that intrigued him enough to even start developing it. So today, on What the F*** Happened to This Unmade Horror Movie, we're taking a look at James Wan's Leatherface. In the mid-2000s, there were few people in horror bigger than James Wan, so it makes sense that he would be approached to helm entries in some pretty classic horror franchises. Twisted Pictures had produced Saw and had decided to approach the rights holders to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise and make a sequel. This immediately had Wan intrigued, as he had always been a fan of the series. See, the Texas Chainsaw movies have an interesting rights history. Platinum Dunes simply paid for the rights to make the 2003 reboot and its sequel, and in return, the rights holders, Tobe Hooper and Kim Henkel, would receive a small percentage, but no creative control. It's low risk, low reward. But Twisted Pictures approached Hooper and Henkel to see if they would instead partner up with them on the project. This would give them both more input on the creative decisions, but also a larger percentage of the profits. This also meant a lot more work and a lot more pressure placed on the pitch itself, which is why Twisted approached their golden child, James Wan, about the project. Writer of both remakes of The Grudge, Steven Susko, joined forces with Wan in order to develop a story. The idea of having free reign was intriguing enough to both of them, and so they started brainstorming what their ideal Texas Chainsaw movie would look like. I want to thank you guys for watching What the F*** Happened to This Unmade Horror Movie, and ask that if you enjoy our shows, please subscribe to our channel right now, like this video, and click on the bell so you can be notified each time a new video goes up. And now, back to the show. They went into it with a very simple idea. What makes Leatherface tick? Oh yes, I can already hear the groans from here. Many people have had this idea before and since, and it hasn't exactly turned out well. But maybe this time will be different? Maybe? In Susko and Wan's story, a wealthy Tonkawa tribe had isolated itself from the rest of the world so they could perform their religion. That religion just happens to involve carving up human beings and eating them. To each their own, I guess. This could explain why the local authorities aren't around in this part of Texas. But there was a certain family in the tribe that took things way too far and bastardized the religion. So they were separated from the group and treated more like a pariah, with the local authorities just kind of keeping an eye on them. But where I think the story really goes off the rails is its inclusion of Native Americans. See, in wanting to discover what circumstances could possibly create the Sawyer family, Susko wanted to dive into Texas's real-life history with cannibals. But these weren't backwoods rednecks. No, there aren't any of those in Texas. Instead, they were a Native American tribe known as the Tonkawa. They practiced ritualistic cannibalism and could have been the explanation for several aspects of the Leatherface story. Whenever dealing with a new entry in an established series, it can be tough as to where to place the film. Do you give the story time to breathe and take place in present day? Susko decided that they would start their film right after Hooper and Henkel's original film left off, with Sally Hardesty escaping in the back of a pickup truck. Given the time that's passed, this obviously could not have been original star Marilyn Burns, so the idea was to recast the role with someone that looked enough like her that it didn't immediately take the audience out of the scene. You know, because who needs someone that can act? But don't get too attached, because things don't go well for our prior lead. Turns out that semi-truck from the end of the original was actually part of the tribe and is holding a bunch of human carcasses for consumption. This is when Sally is murdered with an axe. Yup, they just straight up kill her off right from the jump. I imagine that going over well with horror fans. Then there's Leatherface himself, who we'd see injured from his run-in with Sally, only to have his home burned to the ground by the Tonkawa tribe. He'd then be taken to pay for his and his family's transgressions. From here, they'd jump 37 years into the future. Leatherface has been placed in a slaughterhouse by the tribe with an abusive older couple keeping watch over him. He no longer has his mask made of human skin. Instead, it's been replaced with a cloth mask that has been screwed into his face. It's a pretty grisly sight and could really be a great look. But the whole setup feels very similar to what we saw in the beginning, so it feels pretty old hat. Eventually we get to see Leatherface, you guessed it, break out and kill the old couple. He acts much closer to what we would eventually see in the 2022 film, a hulking brute that dispatches large groups of people in no time at all. In fact, the entire script feels very much in the same vein as the Platinum Dunes films that had come just prior. Honestly, it's kind of hard to see the reverence for the original because of how much it just feels like yet another sequel. Needless to say, the screenplay doesn't really impress. The story goes about how you would expect it, with Leatherface eventually attacking a group of young people and just absolutely terrorizing them. Again, feels very been there, done that. But I guess that's what Lionsgate wanted. And while that was just the first film, the pitch was actually for a whole trilogy, not just one movie. And they each would have taken place during a different day. They even had the idea that James Wan would direct the first one, Tobe Hooper would step in and direct the second one, and then they had even talked about potentially having Neil Marshall come in for the third. Wan went as far as to meet Hooper about the idea. Tobe Hooper and Kim Henkel both ended up being big fans of the pitch and approved it going forward. One of Wan's more interesting ideas was the concept of Leatherface having a different mask depending on what his role was at the time. If he was cooking, he'd be dressed like a mother, with full makeup. But when he had to chase down a would-be victim, we'd have the more gritty mask that we're used to. It would allow the character to have more personality without doing something stupid like having him talk. If some of what we've talked about sounds at least a little familiar, it's because Steven Susko was actually credited for the story of Texas Chainsaw 3D. Given that this is quite possibly the worst entry in the franchise, and it gives little hope that this would have been anything but a colossal failure. But it's also been said that, while he's credited, very little of his script was actually used. So try not to dismiss this just yet, especially given that James Wan has always had quite the eye, so I'm sure it would have been the best that Texas Chainsaw Massacre has ever looked. Unfortunately, this is where things hit a snag. While Twisted Pictures wanted to go the Saw route and fund everything themselves, therefore giving complete creative freedom, it didn't quite work out that way. With Lionsgate having distribution rights, they also wanted to be more involved. And with their involvement came some mandates. First, the movie was to be 3D. Going into the third dimension was all the rage these days. Second, it was to be PG-13. Lionsgate already had a corner on the R-rated fare with Saw every October, so they wanted to be able to hit a very different market. And finally, number 3, there was to be no cannibalism. That's right, they wanted a Texas Chainsaw Massacre film without any people eating. Oh, these idiots.
No, they're saying boo earns, boo earns.
It also came out during the meeting that not everyone at Lionsgate had even seen Tobe Hooper's seminal classic. Talk about being ill-prepared for your job. Needless to say, this completely destroyed Wan and Susko's interest in the project, and they immediately dropped out. Instead, Wan would go on to direct Insidious, while Susko would write and direct Unfriended: Dark Web. Lionsgate instead went with a pitch from Adam Marcus and Deborah Sullivan, and eventually we received Texas Chainsaw 3D. The less said about that film, the better.
Do your thing, cuz.
While we may have never gotten that James Wan Texas Chainsaw film, there is always some kind of hope. While Netflix is in the midst of creating their own set of films, that doesn't mean that James Wan won't take on the franchise in the future. Because if the world of horror has taught us anything, it's that anything can happen.
To me, to find out how guys like
Mike and Chucky and Freddy do what they do, not why. I can't just sit here on the first night I ever met you and explain it to you. It's got to come from your own understanding of the process.
Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon really took the horror world by storm when the trailer first released. Similar to Scream in 1996, Behind the Mask was a meta look at slashers that really made you think. Not just of the titular movie, but of all the movies it's paying homage to.
All the obvious weapons, I've sabotaged.
This Bun trailer had it as the talk of every movie message board, and star Nathan Basil felt positioned to break out huge.
There's that whole thing, making it look like you're walking, and everybody else is running their asses off.
But then it released, and while it was widely liked, the film had trouble tapping into a larger market, which meant that the sequel we thought was all but certain just never came to pass. So today on What the F Happened to This Unmade Horror Movie, we look at why we never received Before the Mask, The Return of Leslie Vernon. For those of you that have never seen The Rise of Leslie Vernon, let me summarize. Behind the Mask is a mockumentary that follows Taylor Gentry and her film crew as they document the preparations of an up-and-coming killer, Leslie Vernon. See, famous killers like Freddy, Michael, and Jason all actually exist in this world. During the midst of this, they track the would-be final girl and her friends to an old farmhouse. This is when shit truly hits the fan and Taylor and her crew find themselves part of Leslie's violent game.
This is my fault? Because I'm sexually active?
There's a lot of little twists and turns, but that's the gist of the story, and it's a damn good one. He's even got his own little Dr. Loomis-like character in Doc Halloran, played by Robert Englund. During the credits, Leslie seems to have been defeated, but security camera footage from the morgue shows that's just not true. This little tease of Leslie still being alive was enough to have those that love the film clamor for a sequel. I want to thank you guys for watching What the F Happened to This Unmade Horror Movie, and ask that if you enjoy our shows, please subscribe to our channel right now, like this video, and click on the bell so you can be notified each time a new video goes up. And now, back to the show. Don't get me wrong though, there's definitely a sect of people that feel that Behind the Mask really jumped the shark in the third act when it became a full-blown slasher. They feel it became the exact movie that it was parodying.
You have to tell me, what happens to me?
I'm not one of those people and would have been disappointed if we hadn't seen Leslie get to do his thing and go full slashy. But for those that feel slighted, a sequel would be a good way to course correct. Screenwriter David Stev has always had an idea for a Leslie Vernon sequel. In fact, he's had a story for the whole trilogy ever since the first initial inception. Because that's what you do with horror, right? Always plan for a franchise? But the form that it took shifted throughout the years as they tried repeatedly to get it made. Glosserman pitched an idea to MTV Films for a TV series that would have followed Angela Gothel's Taylor as she runs a school of survivor girls. She sets up a To Catch a Predator style situation where a killer walks into either a fraternity or sorority house, then they're cornered by a film crew, shaming them for coming to kill a bunch of innocent people. You can see the dry humor from the original at play here.
Would you say that most of these are
Work-related? Well, I wouldn't suggest reading Grey's Anatomy for kicks.
And you can see how much fun that this could potentially be. An issue Glosserman kept running into was that no one was interested in making their sequel. What they were interested in, though, was remaking the film, but doing so with big-name actors. But that went against what Glosserman was hoping for, as he truly wanted to bring back Nathan Basil and Angela Goethals for the film.
Fuck!
His intrigue was seeing these characters interact again after the events of the first one. Some of the most progress came when Adam Goldberg of The Goldbergs came aboard to executive produce the project. With him having such a massive hit at ABC, it seemed certain we'd finally get the sequel. but still no studio was interested. This was when the idea of a Kickstarter came up. The initial Kickstarter goal was $450,000. Sure, that's a pretty minuscule amount, but Glosserman had an investor that would match the amount. $1 million for a film in the late '80s was a pretty big ask, but the team still felt they could do it. Hello! They even used Nathan Basil to promote the venture as Leslie Vernon. And there's even some story progression in this little video, as we can see that Leslie is now married to Jamie, which just brings up a whole slew of questions. Unfortunately, on Kickstarter, you need the fully pledged amount or all the money is returned to the backers. Since they had only managed $180,000, a still mightily impressive feat, especially at the time, the project failed and they had to start back at square one. The story of Before the Mask actually serves as both a prequel and a sequel. It kind of treads similar ground to Scream 3, in that there's a film within a film element going on. I mean, let's hope that it's a little better, but who knows. See, the events of the first film are being made into a movie called The Harvest Murders. The film within a film would allow us to see some origin material with Leslie, without actually going the prequel route. This is smart because if something doesn't work, it can just be blamed on the Harvest Murders not getting it right. Because I don't know about you, but I have no interest in seeing how Leslie came to be. What I do have an interest in is seeing how Leslie could possibly interact with both Taylor and Doc Halloran after the events of the first one.
We're not gonna see each other after tonight anyway. We might as well just say our goodbyes now.
After a bunch of people are getting murdered on the set of Harvest Murders, the cops shut down the production, with the caveat that it cannot resume until Leslie is either captured or killed, because obviously Leslie must be the one doing it. I think you know where this is going. The director contacts Taylor in order to set up a trap to lure Leslie out of hiding so he can get back to filming his movie. But when Leslie is found, it turns out he's innocent from the production killings. So Taylor and Doc Halloran must team up with Leslie in order to find out what's actually happening. It allows there to be a bit of a twist and still provides some meta moments for the viewer. Then the actual sequel does do some weird stuff, like develop a romance between Taylor and Leslie. The overall tone of Before the Mask is still really fun. There are some pretty funny jokes made about how much Hollywood pushes everything to 11.
These go to 11.
The slight tussle with Doc Halloran is now expanded into a full-blown karate sequence. Then the film version of Leslie is this hulking mute more akin to Jason Voorhees. But with every year that passed, so did the opportunity to make the film. It's 2022 and we don't seem any closer to getting a sequel. Glosserman has said that the time to make Before the Mask has unfortunately passed, since that story took place just 1 year after the original film. And not to mention people like Scott Wilson having passed. Fortunately, they were able to release a comic book series based on their script in 2017. Nathan Thomas Milliner brought to life the story that Glosserman and Stev had created. The comic served as a way to finally tell the story they'd concocted a decade prior, but also to prove to studios that there was still fan interest in the character. Just because the story of Before the Mask had been told doesn't mean that they were done telling stories of Leslie Vernon. Nathan Basil has mostly moved on from acting and works as a production coordinator for the popular Deadliest Catch TV show. But every time he's been asked about the role, he's adamant that he'd love to return. The window of opportunity seems to be shrinking more and more as the years pass, but fan interest seems to be there, with Scream 2022 reigniting the meta dissection of slasher films. Maybe another opportunity for Leslie Vernon to return is on the horizon. I know I'll be keeping my scythes crossed. Let us know if you'd like to see a sequel to Behind the Mask, and we'll see you in the next episode.
It is going to get wet in here tonight. Lace your boots up, kitties.
While zombie films are in a bit of a lull right now, the mid-2010s were a hotbed of crazy zombie ideas, thanks in no small part to Robert Kirkman's The Walking Dead. So with renewed interest in the genre, people were clamoring for the godfather of zombiedom himself, George Romero, to make his triumphant return. So you can imagine the excitement when in 2015 it was announced that Romero would be making a new entry in his zombie saga, with the logline, "The story is set on an island where zombie prisoners race cars in a modern-day coliseum for the entertainment of wealthy humans." Zombie drag racers? Okay then, I guess they're going super literal with the title this time, because today on What the Fuck Happened to This Unmade Horror Movie, we're taking a look at George A. Romero's Road of the Dead.
When there's no more room in hell, the dead will walk here.
Romero's zombie films have always played with the concept of the dead regaining some of their memories and actions from their previous life. It's why we have zombies handling guns and going to the mall. Their past life calls to them.
He remembers everything that he used to.
But what writer Matt Berman wanted to do may have taken it a little too far. He was obsessed with the idea of zombies driving. Yes, you heard that right. His logic was that it was just a natural progression of what we've already seen that these zombies are capable of. His argument was that all of Land of the Dead was about Big Daddy and his group of zombies pursuing the truck Dead Reckoning all the way to Fiddler's Green. So why would they just stop? They should be following them all the way up to Alaska. And walking would just take way too much time. So Berman concocted the idea that they would instead drive vehicles, and therefore be able to pursue the crew of Dead Reckoning with ease. As someone who absolutely hates the idea of evolving zombies, and feel it should have stopped at Bub in Day of the Dead, this sounds absolutely atrocious. But okay, it's not my script, so let's go through this thing and give Road of the Dead a chance. Berman decided that he was going to start his movie on the final shot of Land of the Dead, with Dead Reckoning driving off as they set off fireworks and Big Daddy watches them drive off. Feeling that Big Daddy wouldn't just stop his pursuit, Berman contended that since he had already proven to use tools to get what he wanted in the name of pursuing these humans, who's to say he wouldn't get behind the wheel of a car? Talk about making things complicated. And the complications just kept coming though, because despite this being a Land of the Dead sequel, they weren't able to bring back any characters from it. Hell, they couldn't even use the name Dead Reckoning when referring to the mobile zombie killing truck. This is because they were owned by Universal, while Berman and Romero were doing this outside of the studio system. That also meant that there would be no returning Simon Baker or Asia Argento. Their solution to this was to just kill off all but one of the remaining characters from Land. And that remaining character wouldn't even be named, so it's likely someone random like this blonde lady. Now, this isn't a completely make or break moment because none of Romero's original trilogy featured the same characters from movie to movie. They were always different, so this wouldn't have exactly been outside of the norm. But it makes the decision to still follow the crew of the Dead Reckoning to be a very strange one. Why even follow them in the first place? Can't this just be a whole new story just like the other films? Not to mention the fact that this decision makes Land's Riley character look like an absolute idiot. He has a chance to kill these zombies, and he lets them go.
They're just looking for a place to go. Same as us.
In fact, Romero seems to even make a point to show that Big Daddy isn't interested in pursuing them anymore. So why on earth would they go after them? Seems like a pretty big change. Either way, our lone survivor ends up on a remote island in Canada,
that has successfully cut itself off from the zombie plague. The human race is flourishing again, and they're really starting to make a new world. You know, other than the fact that they have this crazy coliseum that they put the zombies in for entertainment. Think the cage from Land of the Dead turned up to 11. Given the vehicular entertainment, there's a lot more action here than your typical zombie fare. While the budget would prevent it from going full Mad Max Fury Road, it was certainly to be more than we had gotten in any of the other Dead films. Then there's the rich bigwig that's at the center of it all. He practically mirrors the Dennis Hopper character from Land, so it's one of many ways where the story feels very been there, done that. Not to mention the scientist who's trying to cure the zombies. Again, very been there, done that. But even with all of these changes to the standard zombie, one thing they made sure to avoid was having them run. While that may have been a popular trope since 28 Days Later and the Dawn of the Dead remake, Romero's zombies walked, and that was that. So at least Berman got that right. And remember Machete, Tom Savini's character from Dawn of the Dead that actually ended up showing up in Land? Well, he would have a role here, having followed along with Big Daddy all the way up to Canada. As much as I enjoyed the concept of bringing people back, bringing back a zombie version of someone who's already considerably older than when we saw him last is a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, I love those Walt and Jesse cameos in Better Call Saul just as much as the rest of us, but I mean, they looking old. But this is George A. Romero's Road of the Dead after all, so when exactly does he get involved? I've mentioned Berman's name a lot, but not a lot of Romero. Well, after several of Berman's drafts, Romero wasn't a fan of the dialogue. He felt that it needed to be funnier, so he did a pass on it, adding in some jokes and aligning the dialogue more with what he himself considered to be good. Now, I'm not sure if you've seen many Romero zombie movies, but I wouldn't consider the dialogue to be exactly a strong point.
One-stop shopping. Anything you need right at your fingertips.
Romero is more of a social commentator versus a witty linguist. So the fact that this is Romero's main contribution to the script is pretty concerning. And in a very strange turn of events, Romero attaching his name to the project ended up making it significantly harder to get the film made. Because while progress on the film was moving forward, George unfortunately entered poor health. Just 2 weeks before they were going to announce the film, Romero passed away. However, many people still wanted to make the film in an effort to pay respect to Romero's legacy. So the film wasn't completely screwed yet. But with Romero's name attached, it meant that those who were now in charge of this estate were now also in charge of approving what his name was on. And they didn't feel the script was up to snuff. Berman, feeling that the script was ready to go, and he didn't want to make sacrifices to appease Romero's estate, especially when George himself had already approved that script, so he refused. While I would have loved to have seen Romero enter the zombie void one last time before his passing, his last few entries proved that maybe it's better to just let the dead, well, remain dead. Because unfortunately, every entry has just taken a little of the shine off of those that came before it. Even as someone who enjoyed Diary, I can't pretend it's even a few levels within the brilliance of the original trilogy. With Romero having passed in 2017, progress on the project halted. And honestly, I'm not sure if that's a bad thing. As much as Berman makes this out to be that this is all about honoring Romero's legacy, that feels pretty disingenuous. Many elements of Road had already been done in both Diary and Survival, and as much as Berman likes to claim that this is the last thing George wanted to make, we already received his final Dead entry in book form with the release of The Living Dead. And Romero did more than just a dialogue pass on that one. So if there was ever a proper way to continue George's legacy, adapting The Living Dead seems to be the best option. because it has been both well liked by fans and had George contribute to it in a significant way, unlike Road. Berman claims that his movie will be made under the title Wolf Island, since he legally can't connect it to the Of the Dead world. So if this concept intrigues you, and I mean I really can't imagine why, then keep an eye out for that. Meanwhile, for the rest of us, we have the wonderful Dead series to look back on and enjoy for all its biting social commentary. Let's just ignore all the snake oil salesmen who came after the fact. What did you think of Road of the Dead? Do you think I'm being too harsh? Is there some potential that I'm just not seeing? Sound off in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next one.